You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.
So it was National Night Out on past Tuesday evening. Did any of you have a National Night Out, like block party? Okay, a few. Okay. It's a night where neighbors, you come out and you get to know your neighbors a little bit. And oftentimes, police departments, fire departments, they'll have people that'll kind of drop by and hang out with you. And we didn't do one on our block this year, but some years we have. They're fun. They're kind of a way just to kind of connect to your neighbors. This is a picture of, not ours, but a random person's National Night Out. And it's kind of the ideal. It's neighbors coming out and breaking bread with one another. Not all neighbors are like this. Russ and Laverne, who were the neighbors right next door to my family when I was growing up, they were horrid. They really didn't like having a family with kids living next to them. What they really wanted was to live in a senior living center, which is what they told us. And so, right as we moved in, they demanded that my parents put up a fence so that our footballs, frisbees, and whatever would not get out onto their strip of grass. Okay, well, we wanted a dog anyway, so that was fine. We put the fence up. But once that fence was up, they called the city inspectors out because there wasn't a gate. There was a gate in the back, but there wasn't one on the side because there was an easement. And they said, well, there was no way to get through the easement. They were not wrong. So I helped my father, and we put a gate into the fence. Then they promptly planted a tree right in front of it so you couldn't open it. There was a hot day. We didn't have air conditioning, but it was a hot day. North Dakota does get hot sometimes, and there was a hot day, and so my friends and I, we were out playing with water balloons, throwing them at each other to cool down. And one water balloon was overthrown, and it hit the neighbor's garage. Russ and Laverne promptly called the police and told the police that we had filled the balloons with chemicals that would take the paint off their garage. The police told them that they were troublemakers and they should leave us alone. We celebrated. Laverne screamed at the officers all the way back to their squad car and then proceeded to scream at us. The pinnacle, though, was one spring, some birds had, in that very same fence, some birds had built a nest in the fence, and we were enjoying watching them. We watched the eggs hatch, and the parent birds were coming and feeding the babies. And we also watched when Russ came back with a stick and he killed the baby birds in front of us.
You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Okay. Human beings are innately tribal. We define our tribes in many ways. Sometimes it's by age, sometimes by race, sometimes by nationality or religion. But however we imagine our tribes, we are wired by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and social conditioning to fear others, people who are outside our tribe. Our brains are wired to make instant judgments about others. And our fear response is faster, it's more intense, and it lasts longer than any other emotion that we have, even lust. Out of all of this innate, natural fear of others, it makes it incredibly remarkable that very early on in Israel's history, God's people are explicitly commanded to love foreigners, strangers, as yourself.
Any immigrant who lives with you must be treated as if they were one of your citizens. You must love them as yourself, because you were immigrants in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
This is a frequently overlooked commandment. It gets overshadowed by the more popular one, which is to exclude and drive out strangers, particularly Canaanites. And there was a time back in American history where preachers like me would stand in pulpits and they labeled Native Americans Canaanites to justify moving them off the land. The impulse for tribalism is powerful inside all of us, which is why the commandment to love your neighbor, not just tolerate them, but love them, in the book of Leviticus, which is not a book known for its tolerance, it's why it's so remarkable. Because it goes against how we're wired. The very presence of strangers can bring anxiety. Evolution has hardwired our brains to be cautious and self-protective. When even a rustle in the grass caused our fear response, our limbic system, to go to red alert. It's a survival mechanism. And when that fear response goes into effect, the hormone cortisol floods our limbic system, and it overrides our brains. It gives us the message that the most important thing that we can do, in fact, the only thing that in that moment that we can do, is focus on fight or flight. And people manipulate this impulse. People have learned to use fear as a tool. Even though crime rates nationally are falling, 2/3 of the people in our nation don't believe that. They believe they're rising. The world is falling apart. Older adults are far less likely to be victimized by violent crime. And yet, they're much more, they've been told to be more fearful than young people. There's a huge disconnect between our fears and the reality around us. We've been fed fear for profit, fear for power for a while, and we've been manipulated and messed with. What do you think those early preachers were doing so long ago? They were using fear. So we retreat back into our perceived tribes where we feel safe. Older adults, by and large, have very few deep relationship with younger people outside of their family and, well, churches and religious communities. The political and the racial divide has us living in different versions of America. And yet this morning, I proclaim that this is not the world that God intends. In Jesus' parable of the great judgment, when the nations would be judged, the human one says to the blessed sheep,
I was a stranger and you welcomed me.
And in welcoming the stranger, the blessed sheep honor God unaware. And what we do together, being church, this is a joyful act in which
you are no longer strangers and aliens. Rather, you are fellow citizens with God's people, and you belong to God's household.
God has has not left us in this world to be slaves to our biologic, our genetic nature. In God, revealed in Jesus, even though we are born with natural fear impulses, that we are born in bondage to fear and to lust and greed and pride, to name a few others, the Spirit that was put inside of you can give you the power to be different, to grow. Because no matter how powerful our fears are, how real they are, no matter that they even have the power to block conscious thought, we can train our fears. And yet some will say, we've got to be realistic, right? God created us with these fears for self-protection, right? After all, we're only human, right? We've justified ourselves, our tribalism. Jesus did not mean for us to love merely to be more just. This is the way it always has been and always will be. It's either them or us. The evil that has been done to us requires swift, strong retribution without pity. Bomb them into the Stone Age. They forced us to do it. Violence is all they understand. They asked for it. It's in my genes. Ever has it been, such it will always be, world without end. I do not want to be trapped in such a world. I seek the freedom of new life in Jesus Christ. With all of God's creatures, yes, we share an innate survival instinct of fear of the other. But we can deliberate. We can decide whether to fight or flight. We can prayerfully contemplate. And by the grace of God, the good news is we have a choice. Yes, we do have this inheritance of fear that's hardwired into us. But we also, just as powerfully, more powerfully, have wired into us social inclusivity, interactiveness. We are also wired for communion. Just as fear can release hormones, powerful hormones, so can happiness and well-being. They can release oxytocin, which lowers our blood pressure and increases our feelings of wholeness and joy. It may not be as instantly powerful as fear, but when you train yourself to expect well-being and trust, we can teach ourselves then to intentionally reach out, to be those couplers, to reach out to others, to connect. What I am learning on this journey with Jesus is that we are not left to fend for ourselves. We are not powerless in the face of evil, the evil that's inside of us or the evil that's in others. We are more than slaves to our history and our biology, because God has created us to live with God and in communion with each other. God has the power to teach us that we have a choice. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace are valid, natural fears in this life that by God's grace protect us. But by that same grace teaches us to manage our fears, to move beyond our fears and our distrust. Jesus doesn't require that you look at your neighbor. You look at Russ and Laverne as some sort of innocuous, lovable image of ourselves, glossing over our differences. Show a little inclusiveness just to show that we're good people. Jesus doesn't simply ask us to tolerate our neighbor and their horridness, to live separately but somehow theoretically equal. Jesus calls you to love your neighbor, to see all humanity as the broken and yet beautiful creatures we are, and to seek justice and well-being for all people. Love calls us to communion, to embrace each other, to say, I love you and there's nothing you can do about it. Love calls us to live together as a household of God. We've been invited to gather tonight down at the J.C. Nichols Fountain in support of transsexual neighbors. And I got the social media invite for this. And I dutifully forwarded it. Bruce is our justice and witness. I dutifully forwarded the invitation on. And I looked at it, and I honestly, my first impulse was to stay at home. Sundays kind of take it out of me, honestly, and I get tired. But this week, as I prepared to come and to proclaim God's love of neighbor, it wasn't enough for me to come in and prattle on at you about sweetman sentimentalities that all you need is love, dun 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 dun. Now we've been invited. Yeah, the invitation came through social media. You can easily forget about those. Yeah, the invitation came by the Reverend John Dorhauer, also via social media. The invitation also comes by Jesus himself to demonstrate love. To your poor black, your rich white, Jewish, Muslim, NRA conservative Republican, class-hating Democrat, atheist, homophobe, exuberantly transsexual. All are neighbors as ourselves. Even Russ and Laverne. Prayed for them this week. A few minutes, I'm going to pray for them again. So in the name of love, I'm going. And I'm inviting you to, in the name of grace, in the name of love. We're going to gather out here in the church parking lot about 6:30. We're going to carpool together if you want to come. Just want to go straight down to the fountain. We're going to go down to widen our community, to couple, as Bob put it. Make our tribe beyond reach out to others, many of whom have little trust of Christians based on what they've seen and heard. Here's an interesting note. When we received our invitation, I responded back that a group of us from Colonial Church might be there. It took them days to post it because they didn't necessarily know if they wanted a church at such a gathering, because can Christians be trusted? We've got a ways to go.
This is how we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep God's commandments. This is the love of God. We keep God's commandments. God's commandments are not difficult because everyone who is born from God defeats the world. And this is the victory that has defeated the world, our faith.
Christ has freed us in faith to do what our culture, our world finds difficult, to embrace, to dare to take responsibility for each other. So in faith to the commandment to love our neighbors, let's go and extend our community, our communion to all.